before we before we decide what they're going to talk about, before we pick the real life, before we pick visuals, before we do any of this, the first thing we have to do is figure out what the edge of their understanding is around this concept. What are their strengths? What do they bring to the table? What do they already have on board? And so that is step number one. Step number one is discovering the edge of their understanding. So that means we have to set some expectations. We have to engage in initial assessments. We have to engage in what's called teacher noticing. And finally, we have to identify the gap. Now, in this case, the gap is a good thing. The gap is not about deficits. The gap is not about what they can't do in a negative sense. It's an opportunity. In other words, deficits, throw that language out. We're talking about opportunities. Where do we need to focus our attention? Discovering the edge of understanding. These four things have to happen first before we make any decisions elsewhere. So let's talk about how this might look. Remember those two schools that we talked about? I keep bringing it back up because I want to show you something super cool. It turns out that what separated those two schools was the amount of time those mathematics learners devoted to on grade level or grade appropriate tasks and assignments. Now, this data is quite striking. In schools that saw continued growth, they determined the edge of their students' mathematical understanding and then immediately started to develop interventions that were grade appropriate interventions. In other words, they worked on a third grade level if they were in third grade, and they made adjustments to those interventions. Now, we're going to talk about that in a moment. Katiri's going to talk to you about that. They spent more time on grade level appropriate assignments. So those schools that didn't show growth, they spent time on remediation, not intervention. In fact, here's the data. Here's what it looks like. If you look at that green line actually shows the growth of schools that devoted their time, intervention, on grade level appropriate assignments versus a remediation approach, which is that second line. This is a 2018 study. It's quite striking. And so the first and foremost point here is that we have to know where our students are, but then we also have to make sure that when we move forward with interventions that we stick to as close to grade level as we possibly can, and then differentiate. Now, we're going to come back to that in just a minute. But I wanted to lay the foundation right off the bat. Get on grade level as soon as possible. That's rule number one. Find out what the edge of their understanding is and target that. Now, you've spent a lot of time on assessments. In fact, Katiri and I are well aware that some of the previous webinars have focused on assessments. And so we're not going to park there very long. We're not going to spend a lot of time there, but we are going to spend time talking about different ways to do that. But before we do, I want to make sure this point is solid. To discover the edge of their understanding, setting those clear expectations, we're targeting on grade level mathematics. And so when you look at that list of what works best for those items, one answer is, well, it depends on their edge of understanding and what the grade level expectations are. From there, we have to then develop our initial assessments. Now, Katiri is going to walk us through some ideas about how to discover their edge of understanding, which should be a review for us, but we want to make sure that we devote some time to this. Right, Katiri?
Absolutely. So I think one thing that I constantly have to remember when I'm teaching is that I don't want to stop teaching to find out where that edge of understanding is. I don't want to pause everything because I have limited time with my kids, right? So how do you find that edge of understanding while engaging in learning, right? That assessment by learning, as learning, for learning, all of those things together. And so we already have things, right? You guys probably have your go-to strategies. You may be observing. One of the keys that I always have to remember is I have to document what I observed so I can look at it again later and not rely on my perceptions of what happened, but the documentation of what really happened. All of those times that you're interacting with students, that you're asking questions, that you're conferring with students as you go around, document those. That is all formative assessment to help understand where that edge of understanding is. Asking students to do tasks like summarizing and probing questions, asking them to reflect and to inquire, those can all be things where if they're recording it, even just in a short, quick way, like an exit slip, Those are ways that we can find out where their edge of understanding is. And of course, all through the pandemic, we learned lots of ways that we can use technology to help engage kids in recording what they've learned and how they know they've learned it. And that can be things like Loom and Flipgrid and Teachback. So some way where you're asking them even to record themselves explaining that, that can be a form of formative assessment. So just some quick ideas in case you're thinking, well, how am I going to remember to be observing and conferring and also documenting? So these are some of my go-tos. So sometimes they just have like a wide open chart and I record a student's name, what they're working on, and what I want to remember from that moment. I also have places in there so that I can keep track of what our goal was for learning that day. So I can make sure that my questions are planned and I know what I want to ask. That helps me to really stay on grade level and to make sure that my questions are probing into the places that I need to find out what to do next for that student. I can also have ways to record what I'm doing with students based off of strategies. If that's the thing that I'm really trying to find out, well, what strategies are my students using? And you all said it, right? CRA, huge. Starting with hands-on, moving to pictorial, then moving to abstract, figuring out where those misconceptions are. You could anticipate that and then really notate that. Know where are they? Are they kind of sitting with concrete materials and they need to move forward? Have they really got that abstract, but they're showing a misconception? Document that and keep track of it. Another one is number talks. I saw some people saying that that's a really effective way to work with students to help them build some strategies, and it is. Having some way to document, well, how are they actually using what I've taught in that number talk, those strategies? How are they using it in their work? That can be a really powerful way to find out where a gap is. So perhaps they're just using that double strategy that we practiced in the near double strategy from the number talk. Maybe they're using it inaccurately when they're working by themselves, or maybe just as a surface level, but they're not really using it to manipulate more challenging numbers, or maybe you can see some meaningful use. And this, looking at this, recording this can really help you identify, okay, here's some patterns in what I'm noticing with my learners. I notice that these learners need a number talk that focuses on making tens and helping them transfer and making that really meaningful. So I can meet with that group and do a number talk on making tens. Or perhaps you notice that all of your students are really ready and needing to work on making landmark or friendly numbers. And so that's where, as a whole class, you move next. So remember, all of that documentation that you're doing, as students are working, you can find out so much about where that edge of learning is. Other things that we can start to rethink, like homework, right? What would be meaningful homework? Well, a meaningful way to engage kids, especially in the upper elementary grades in homework, is just having them to reflect, right? Have them reflect on, well, here's what we've been working on. Mathematicians make numbers easier to work when they can. And here's some proof that I have that I know how to do that. Ask the students to provide the proof and then reflect on what's something you're proud of from your work this week. You could also, just in class, real quick, you've done all this work and say, okay, well, today we were working on dividing fractions. Do you feel like you can do that? Yes, no. And put that on your work and then turn it in. You could have them sort their work based off of where they perceive themselves as owning the understanding or needing a little more support. And that can also give you additional insights into that formative understanding and into where that edge of understanding is. So we're really working on first discovering, but not pausing instruction to discover, engaging with learners as they're learning and helping to document so that then after all the craziness of the whole day, you can remember, okay, here's what I noticed. So here's my plan for the next day. Here's exactly how I'm going to meet each kid's need. The other thing to notice in these patterns, right, is to figure out, well, where is their edge? Are they in a place where they're working on conceptual understanding? Are they in a place where they're working on procedural knowledge? Or are they working on that application? And when you have that documentation of student work or observation, you can start to see those patterns like, oh, I think they get the concept of multiplication, or they get the concept of skip counting, but I don't think they quite have that procedure down, right? Or I don't think they're quite ready to apply it. And that's where I need to step in, right in that spot. So that brings us to another one of those big ideas. that what works best means we have to align the type of math learning with what we're going to do. Our instruction has to match what our goal is. If we're aiming for conceptual or procedural application understanding, then we need to make sure that we're using instructional strategies that match each of those areas. And we know that, right? You know that from working with students. You know that from being a math learner yourself, that learning a procedure is different from learning the concepts or from applying those concepts. And as a learner, it feels different, right? And so as a teacher, we need to make sure that we're matching our instruction to that type of learning. We need to say, okay, well, if you're working on procedures, then the way I'm going to intervene, the type of strategy I'm going to use to help you make sense of that procedure is different than if I was working on a concept or working on an application. All right, so let's just take a quick moment to clarify some terms, right? So we said conceptual understanding, procedural knowledge, application. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, right? Conceptual understanding is where in math, we're understanding the meaning behind those practices or processes. We're making sense of why relationships, okay? So when you're thinking, I'm trying to discover where are my students, where's their edge of understanding, and you're looking for, are they making sense of why, or is that the place that's kind of tripping them up a little and I'm ready to dive in to build up what they do understand to help them make sense of new ideas. Is it procedural knowledge and fluency? So that is that ability to select, use, and transfer procedures in problem solving, right? So, and then you're moving into that fluency place where you're really trying to consolidate them so that you can be a fluent problem solver. So really thinking through, well, there's so many procedures, right? Because there's ways of representing and there's operations and different types of numbers. So really engaging in your discovery to find out, well, is it that they're not sure which procedure to select, or if they're not sure how to use it, or they're not sure how to transfer it to this new place, or is it a matter of fluency? And then as we'll see in just a moment, whichever one of those it is, we have strategies that can meet that need. The third type of learning that might be going on mathematically is application. So application of math concepts and thinking skills is where you're thinking about that authentic situation or something that is new or unfamiliar. So you've worked on it in this situation, and now you're asking students to transfer to something that is new. Can they take that and manipulate it and really do some of that metacognitive thinking of, well, here's what I've learned. How am I going to apply it here? And if that is the edge of their understanding, they're ready to make that leap, then what are the strategies that we need to use to help make that transfer happen? So just as a quick example, along the bottom, you can see if this was my math work in multiplication with 3rd and 4th grade students, conceptual understanding would be around making meaning of multiplication. What does it really mean? Fluency or procedural knowledge would be around figuring out, well, what are those division strategies I could use? What are those multiplication strategies I can use? And then the application would be, if I know these strategies for small numbers with multiplication and division, can I revise them to large numbers? So I just want to make sure that we kind of know what we're looking for when we're listening to students talk and looking at student work, right? So we're looking for, do they get that big idea? Do they have those strategies that they can select? And then are they starting to apply them and transfer them? All right, so what is this really, what could this look like or sound like, right? If we're trying to find out where are our students, we're trying to discover where's their edge of understanding, and we're trying to make sure that we're maximizing our instructional time as we do that, and we're trying to listen for conceptual understanding, procedural knowledge, and application. That's a lot to listen for, right? So we're going to watch a video of a 3rd grade class that is doing this work. So you'll see that they haven't stopped learning to do their assessment. They're going to be doing some assessment as learning, and you'll be able to hear and see some of their edges of understanding in each of these areas, so that as the students are recording their work, then the teacher is able to look back at it and say, okay, I can identify where are some patterns, where are perhaps some groups of students and some overall work as a class we need to do. All right, let's watch this class. Here they come.
It's another great day at Lockhart Elementary School in Wake County, North Carolina. Students in Mrs. Hunt's 3rd grade classroom are excited and ready to continue their innovative work that is redefining rigor, assessment, and accountability. In this class, after learning each math lesson, students are challenged to reteach and record what they learned, adding their own spin on the information. Once the students have completed a standards-based lesson, for example about multiplication, they are directed to go to the back of the room to gather one whiteboard and a dry erase marker. They return to their desks and begin creating their lessons by adding handwritten information to the boards. Since students will be reteaching the information, they are thoughtful about how much to put on the board, what vocabulary to use, and what examples they need to include to best illustrate the content. While the students are working, the teacher sets up a tripod and whiteboard stand in the hallway, right outside the door, and simply uses her cell phone to record these one-take lecture videos. When a student has completed his or her board and is ready to teach their lesson, they step into the hallway, place the board on the stand, and press record on the cell phone. Then they sit down and teach the lesson, referencing the information they included on their board. When they are done, they simply press stop and their one-take lecture video is complete. The next student sets up and prepares to teach their version of the lesson, and this process continues until all the students have had a chance to record. Then, the teacher takes the cell phone and plugs it into the computer so the videos can be reviewed and uploaded to a playlist. Mrs. Hunt pulls up a few examples that are reviewed by the whole class, and then explains to the students how she wants them to use a rubric to independently evaluate their work and the work of their peers. The students are assigned to watch a few videos, including their own. The rubric requires that they look closely at what is good about the lesson, but also how each could be improved. They look for content-related issues such as correct use of vocabulary and use of appropriate examples. In addition, they are required to evaluate how well the information is communicated, looking for quality of the speaking voice and overall confidence in the presentation.
Think about parent conferencing. How powerful is it to actually have the students' work to be able to pull up and show the parents what the child has mastered, what they're proficient at, or what they need help with, and how they can help them at home.
I absolutely love watching my child the math videos because she understands them, and when she's at home, she's actually teaching me.
Teaching is the most rigorous form of learning, and in Mrs. Hunt's classroom at Lockhart Elementary, the students are also the teachers.
I think it's good for teachers to use this strategy because it's a creative way for children to show what they know.
This transparent classroom provides us a glimpse into the future of teaching and learning.
When I make these videos, I can see what my problems are and what I need to do to fix them.
So Ms. Hunt uses some really cool teaching strategies, right, to intervene with her students to meet them at their edge of understanding. But let's think, before we dive into what strategies she used, let's think about what did she discover from this work, right? If you're asking students to teach back something they've learned, create what they're going to teach, share it, and even watch themselves to give themselves feedback, or watch a peer and give some feedback. What could you discover? Take a moment, think about it, and then pop it into the chat. What kinds of things might you discover about your learner's edge of understanding in mathematics? Absolutely, Michelle. Possible misconceptions will absolutely come up. And across all of these videos, we could probably find some patterns and misconceptions, which would give me some feedback about my instruction and let me know who I need to talk with, what I need to do to change my instruction. Yep. Creating a model. Absolutely. Yep. What are the different representations are they choosing? How efficient are their strategies? Their depths of understanding. Yep. Their communication. You're going to hear so much language. You're going to see vocabulary recorded, hear it as they're talking about it. Absolutely. Yep. What strategies do they have? What sort of procedural errors do they have, or procedural fluency, right? Always be prepared to be surprised is something that I constantly remind myself as I'm working with kids. And you will be so surprised at the amazing things that they do understand and they are able to do and they are fluent with and they are ready to apply and transfer. And then to find those little spots where with just the right push, just the right intervention at the right time, we'll be able to move each learner forward. That is fantastic. So the other thing she did, Ms. Hunt used some instructional strategies, and she was able to time them just when learners needed it. So she was able to say, okay, we're going to try some teach back. We're going to try some feedback from peers. And those were all powerful because of when her students were or where they were in their understanding. So John, instructional strategies. How do you choose those interventions now that we've discovered where their edge of understanding is? And we've got, okay, here's conceptual that we need, procedural, and application.
Yeah, you know what and before we dive into that, I can't help it every time when I watch that video, talk about how that is the textbook example of assessing while teaching, because you could easily have reversed that and said, you know what? Not for assessment purposes, but for strategies alone. For example, classroom discussion, while the peers are there talking about that. We know classroom discussion has an average effect size of 0.82. Drawing out the pictures, the arrays, imagery has an effect size of 0.51. When you talk about deliberate practice and retrieval practice, you're talking about an effect size of 0.79. And so all of those strategies are wrapped in there. So how is it that she selected and made those decisions? Now, she was getting assessment data, but she was getting assessment data as she was putting those strategies into place. So now let me answer your question, Kateri. That was a rather long-winded explanation, but I promise I'm going to rope it in. It's one of my favorite theories from one of the most profound educational philosophers ever to walk the face of the earth, Kenny Rogers. When John Hattie developed the Kenny Rogers theory of learning in 2016, I don't think he knew what that would do in the United States, because in Australia, it fell flat. There weren't even islands in that stream. It just fell flat. And so thank you for some of y'all. Okay, I see some of you cracking up. I just want to see if you were paying attention. But here's what it is. The Kenny Rogers theory of learning says, look, you got to know when to hold them. You got to know when to fold them. You got to know when to walk away. You got to know when to run. What does that mean? It means while we have this big collection of interventions, and we're going to look at some very specific interventions in just a second, and we're going to talk about how to implement them in just a few moments. The answer to this is, it depends on the learning. If it's conceptual understanding that we're trying to amplify, then there are evidence-based practices that work better than others if I'm trying to amplify procedural learning. So let's look at a couple of examples. Let's say that I were to share with you these evidence-based practices. And what I mean by that is these are all practices that if you were to go in the What Works Clearinghouse, if you were to pull down any book on teaching, if you were to look at any article, these would likely be referenced. These are those strategies that are tried and true, and they are often associated with above average effect sizes. But I want you to look at them through a different lens now. So the Kenny Rogers theory simply says, hey, spaced practice is really good if I'm addressing this edge of understanding, but it may not work over here. And so I want you to take just a moment on your own by yourself. I want you to move quickly through that list. And from the data you collect about your learner's edge of mathematics understanding, where would you put these? Is it guessing that it might be better for conceptual? Might be better for procedural, or might be better for transfer? I'm going to give you just a moment to process that on your own. I'll keep a watch on the time, about a minute and a half, to go through that list and decide conceptual, procedural, or transfer or application, however you want to phrase that last one. A minute and a half. I'll keep a watch on the time. About another 30 seconds. So in the chat box, if you would, and you're welcome to put as many in there. How did you make sense of this? How did you sort through this? Pick a couple out. Where did you place it? Amy's already got us started. Tutoring, extended writing, self-questioning, debates. You were thinking application. That's a great start. Where did others put some of these evidence-based practices, these above average interventions? Where did you put them? Space practice. Yes, space practice is a really strong intervention for procedures, but hang on to that and we're going to come back to it. Note taking for procedural. Okay, great. Thanks for getting us started, Naomi and Kristen. Keep going. What else? Peer tutoring, concepts and transfer. And by the way, peer tutoring has a great effect size. There's a differential effect size on the tutor and the person being tutored. It has a higher effect size for the person being tutored, but there's still above average effect size on the person that's doing the tutoring. There is a differential effect. Vocabulary is conceptual. Yep. Debates, application, reciprocal teaching, concept and transfer. Yeah, absolutely. So the trick is, this is what the research says. Now, Kateri, this is always something that drives me crazy, is that oftentimes in the research, they'll give us an evidence-based practice, but they won't translate that into mathematics speak. So they'll say something like direct instruction. Well, direct instruction, we often link in our brains, correctly or incorrectly, with a lecture and overhead projectors, for those of you that have any idea what overhead projectors are. In other words, we have this image, and we don't do a very good job of translating, thank you, Jen, what these evidence-based practices or interventions look like in mathematics. And so Kateri and I wanted to make sure we did that. This may help us clarify whether it's procedural, conceptual, or application. Let's look at Kenny Rogers through a different lens. In this case, we're going to switch all of those into math speak. Now, what you may find is that it is not always as simple. For example, if I want students to debate different approaches to problems, now that's an application, and that's certainly going to build conceptual, but you also may weave in some procedural. And so the question becomes, what is it that we wanted them to learn? Do we want them to learn the concept of the mathematics concept behind it? Do we want them to learn that some procedures are more efficient than others? Do we want to look at surface level versus deep level similarities and difference in problems? The point being is that each of these have a role. They have a very specific role in mathematics learning. Our job is to figure out what is the edge of the understanding, where is the opportunity for growth, and which of these is going to get us there. If learners are zeroed in on one way to do multiplication, in other words, they want the algorithm, they want the procedure, then maybe we do need some note taking on different models, but then we might have to ask them to discuss the differences in the models. And then we might have to turn right around and have them to engage in some peer tutoring with learners who are moving forward to provide that support, a lot like the teachbacks. Let's say we have learners that are not quite as confident yet in their mathematics language around division. We've done the coffee filters. We've got teddy bears laying everywhere, but we need them to see if they can tie it together. Then maybe we pull in some summarizing and add that into spaced practice. So they do some spaced practice, but then we ask them to summarize their thinking. So we can move these around, weave these in and out that target very specific strengths, but also target very specific edges to understanding. But it still brings me to something that I brought up earlier around the differences between those two schools. Now, you're going to get tired of hearing about those differences in those two schools, because one of the things we often do, Kateri, and you've had to correct me when I have veered down this path, is that sometimes when it comes to edges of understanding, we approach it with a mindset that leads us into a debate that isn't helpful. Oftentimes we say intervention and we automatically jump to remediation. We say intervention and we automatically think deficit. Guess what? There's some new research on this. In fact, it is recent research. It has just come out that has looked at the difference between remediation or acceleration. So I'm going to ask you this, and you know it's a loaded question, but please feel free to answer as honestly as you feel tonight or this afternoon. Which of these produces the greatest amplification or acceleration or movement in student learning? Acceleration or remediation? Which one does it? That's right. That's right. So here's what I'd like to do. We're going to try something a little bit risky because we are on Zoom with over 100 of our closest friends. And so in just a few moments, Kateri and I are going to slide you over into breakout rooms. Now, we won't be in there long. We won't be in there long. I'm going to set those up for you. And here's your task in your breakout room. Here's your task in the breakout room. I want to make sure we have some clarity about what acceleration is and how it's different from remediation. So we're going to slide into breakout rooms. You'll be in the breakout rooms with 5 or 6 of your math colleagues. You'll have approximately 6 minutes, maybe 7 minutes to kind of hammer this out. What is acceleration? What is remediation? How are they similar? How are they different? And when you come back, we're going to look at some of the research and then dive into what we might need to do and how we can look at interventions, that list from Kenny Rogers, to make sure that we're going in with the right mentality and the right mindset that is going to move that learning forward. We're going to have about 7 minutes. Your job is to compare and contrast remediation with acceleration. All right, 8 minutes, 7 minutes, 6 minutes, approximately, give or take, plus or minus. Here we go. So Kristen and Susan, if you are at a place where you can engage and can't get to breakout rooms, we can help. If you're in a situation where you can't engage and you need to hang out in the main room, by all means, that's okay too. But if you can be of help, let us know. All right. Hey, welcome back. So let's look at the difference here in remediation and acceleration. We don't want to park here for long, but I think it's important that when we're talking about structure and interventions, that we go in with the right mindset. When it comes to discovering the edge of their understanding, making sure that we think about our expectations of their learning, that is a huge predictor of how well this is going to work. Teacher expectations, teacher beliefs about what's going to occur in that classroom is a huge predictor of how well that's going to go. It's one of the biggest predictors. For example, not labeling students as being bad at mathematics or struggling with mathematics, not labeling them has an effect size of 0.61. Labeling them has an effect size of negative 0.61. And that's a belief. That's a belief situation. So one of the things that Kateri and I could not spend an afternoon with our favorite colleagues and not mention the role of beliefs. And so what do we see from the data? The data is quite phenomenal. When you look at students receiving learning acceleration and then how they do next or how they move forward, classes with acceleration regained their pre-pandemic success. Now that's awesome. Remediated classes struggled even more the very next year. And so when we think of interventions, we're not thinking about remediation. We're thinking about interventions that accelerate learning and amplify learning. That's the real message here. And by the way, there was a differential effect when it came to students of color or what would be labeled then as Title I eligible schools, where that focus was. So one of the first things that we can absolutely do when it comes to structuring effective interventions is to go in with the mindset that we're going to get them and have them working on grade level with adjustments. But at the same time, our goal is to accelerate, not simply remediate. And it is a frame of mind. It's a different way of thinking about it. And it is essential to their success. How do we know this? Well, when we talk about acceleration, we see it has an average effect size of 0.68. And so the goal is to move that learning forward. And that's really, really powerful. But it doesn't mean, here's the catch, it doesn't mean that we structure those interventions and then just bulldoze our way through because, well, John and Kateri said accelerate. So I'm going to make you do fourth grade work and we're going to move at the speed of light because they said accelerate. Kateri, you're going to kind of walk us through what that really means and how to make sure we stay on grade level, accelerate, not remediate, and get the outcomes that we're after.
Yeah, so that acceleration is all about finding that edge of understanding and then matching what we do to help move students forward using an instructional strategy that really maximizes that time with our learners. That's what the acceleration means. And we can do that just in time, right? When we're talking with a student, when we're conferring with them, when we're working with a group, and we can say, ooh, you know what? I need to ask this question. Oh, they need manipulatives because they're working on their conceptual understanding. They need to engage in some comparing of differences and similarities because they're working on application and transfer. But I can also do this work in my planning in advance where I'm thinking about, okay, how am I going to differentiate this task? So I'm not really thinking about intervention as like pulling kids and having them be in 3 different groups and rotating through, but thinking of what's this rich math task that we could be working on and how can I adjust it to meet all of my learners' needs? How can I make sure that there's that low floor and that high ceiling, right? So that all of them are moving forward into that grade level work and accelerating. So just some background, right? We can differentiate any task, any lesson that we have by changing the content, the process, or the product. And we can make those adjustments based off of learners' readiness or their interest or both. And then there's a whole ton of instructional strategies that we can use that can help organize our thinking as we change those tasks and adjust. That readiness place is where our students in relationship to our learning goal. So how far away are they, right? And so if we're saying, okay, well, they're here, then I need to accelerate their learning, or maybe they're here and I need to accelerate their learning to at least meet those goals, perhaps even move beyond them. Sometimes you can think of readiness as that zone of proximal development, right? That's that, where are they in that learning progression or that learning trajectory towards mastery? Where are they in the edge of understanding? So I can take any task and I can say, well, based on my students' readiness, I'm going to make some adjustments. I can also make adjustments based off of interest. So that could be my personal interest. There's a picture of a baseball stadium because that is my love. I adore baseball. So if you make anything fit baseball, I'm in. So you could do that. You could be finding out your learners, all of their strengths and their powerful things about them, and connect the math to that interest. You could also present in situational interest. So situational interest is where
I'm going to
Situational interest is where you have choices for students, and from those choices, they choose which one in that situation is most interesting to them. Okay, so it might be, well, you have different problems that all work on the same learning goals, but the context changed, or the materials are their choice, or who they're working with are the choice. So you could differentiate based off of readiness, based off of interest, and then these are the 3 parts of your lesson that you could change. You could change the mathematical content, you could change the mathematical process, or you could change the mathematical product. So the content would be things like adjusting the size of the numbers. So everyone's working on the same task, but the size of the numbers are different based on readiness. Maybe the types of numbers are different. Maybe you have some students who are ready to jump in to work with fractions and some who are still working on whole numbers. Maybe the operations are different, right? You have some students who are working on addition and some on subtraction, some on the relationship between. Perhaps your units are different, or your measurement system, the size unit and the equality, are they working with US customary and metric, or just one or the other? What shapes are they working with? Is it just a few polygons? Are they ready for 3D shapes? Are they making connections between them? Graphs, what kind of graph are your learners ready? Are they working with an object graph, or are they working with a bar graph? Are they translating between them? And then patterns, are they working with repeating patterns or growing patterns, shrinking patterns? How complicated of a pattern are they working with? You could make all of those adjustments, but you would still have the same base task. You can also choose, okay, we're all going to do the same task. I'm not even going to adjust that content, but I'm going to change the process for you. So maybe you have a choice of who you work with, or maybe I'm choosing that for you today. Maybe you have a choice of your materials or your resources. Maybe I'm creating the scaffolds, or saying, here, try it with this mathematical tool, because this is the thing you need to learn how to use today. You're learning perhaps how to use a number chart, or perhaps you're learning how to use number bonds. And that is how I'm differentiating for you based on what you're ready for. I can also change the strategies. That's part of the process. So what strategy are you engaging with? Maybe you're choosing it, or maybe I'm saying, hey, you know what? I think today we really need to work on compensation. That's something that we did in our number talk, and it seems like that's an area that you need some practice in. So let's work on that. The product is also something that you can adjust. What learners produce to show what they know. So again, that can change and reflect students' interest or what they're ready for. And there are a ton of differentiation strategies out there, probably even more than this, right? But things that you are both familiar with and maybe new to you. So one thing I want to highlight, though, is that none of these are where I say, I'm going to be working with the red group, and I'm going to be working with the red group for all of the first semester, the whole quarter. That's not this, right? So differentiation that actually accelerates learning, that intervention to meet where students are, it changes. It has to be flexible. So as you introduce your task, you've planned your way that you're differentiating, what you're adjusting, and then you're collecting that data again to move students forward and re-differentiating again. Because of course, your learners learned something that day, right? And you're finding out what that is and then making adjustments again. So these are all amazing strategies, and that all sounds really fabulous, but what does it really actually look like in a classroom, right? So I want to share with you one of my very favorite kindergarten classrooms to visit, where they are working on a trail mix problem. They have been doing all sorts of skip counting and counting collections, but they really are, as a whole, trying to make sense of, well, why would I be skip counting? Why do I want to make groups when I'm counting? So together as a class, they're working on that goal, but then the teacher has done some differentiation using a variety of those strategies. So she's differentiating by readiness and interest. She has an anchor task that everyone is working on and some extensions. She has some choice, and she has some flexible grouping. So you're going to see lots of things mixed together in this, but that's the reality of the classroom, right? So choosing what works for you and then trying it. And then checking in with students and making adjustments just in time is also something that you'll see. All right, so here comes the kindergarten class. And so as you're watching, be looking for the ways that this teacher is differentiating to accelerate learning while they're all still working towards that same goal.
Today's lesson was differentiated in several different ways. One, I thought about where I wanted students to sit and work together, who I wanted working together. I thought about what strategies they would be using in the conversations they would be having. So I predetermined that. I also thought about the numbers that I wanted them working with. So on one sheet, children were working with numbers from 10 and below, and those numbers were numbers that we were traditionally skip counting by in the past, so 2s, 5s, 10s. There was another sheet that had numbers that went from 12 to 25, and those numbers were not numbers that we were traditionally skip counting by, but they would be off by 1 or 2. So for example, it may be 11 instead of 10, so that I could see what the students would do with those numbers. So I had those 2 sheets. We all started by working on the anchor problem, but then from that problem, we went into the 2 different problems. And then from there, I also have another extension plan for students that are ready for that in tomorrow's lesson.
When planning together, we'll think about what specific students will need in the classroom, either to be successful on the anchor problem or to have the extension beyond the anchor problem. And that's how we'll start the conversation about what numbers we want to use, or what manipulatives we want to have out, or what adults we might need in the room during that time. One thing we'll always say to each other when we're planning is we'll ask about specific students. So if we're thinking about Derek, we might say, well, what will Derek do when he gets to this point, or how could we extend this for them? So we'll really think through and make sure that all the extensions are there, and we know that if we get to a wall where we can't extend anymore, then it's probably not a good task for that day.
So we knew for this specific task on this lesson that Derek would probably figure out the totals for his table, so we had already anticipated that our next step would then be to tell Derek that we would need to figure out the totals for the entire classroom.
So you wrote your count down. Yeah, I see what you did there. How did you get this?
I did 2, 4, 6, 8, 10.
I see it. I see it.
And then 5, 10, 14.
What's your plan for tomorrow? You what? Have you figured out your totals here? You have? For what 3 items?
This one.
Do you know what I have to do? My next step would be that maybe you can work on for me, because I would have to figure out for the whole room, not just for your table. Do you know what I mean? Because when I go to the store, I have to actually buy for the whole room. So my next step will be to figure out how much we need for the entire room. Do you want to help with that tomorrow?
Yeah, help you?
Yeah.
Okay, I can help you.
You can? Okay.
All right. So you saw Alicia thinking through, well, first, what is really actually a rich enough task that I can differentiate to make that low floor, high ceiling? And then you saw her thinking about how she was adjusting the content by the different sizes of the numbers, the process. So some of the kids had manipulatives and number charts. They were working in different spaces. And so she was able to take that task and have some extension tasks to help accelerate learning. What she didn't do when she was thinking about intervention was kind of like pulling certain kids and just like working on completely different things. They were all working towards that same goal together as a class. They were really that community of learners. And her intervention is really carefully planned instruction that meets exactly where students are at their edge of understanding and pushes them forward. I love watching that. I love watching Alicia teach. All right, so that intervention is really, really important. And John, I'm gonna pass it to you. Ta-da. There.
So one of the things we have to really zero in on before we move forward is the implementation part of this. And so we're going to go into breakout rooms for a very brief amount of time. It's not going to be a big one, but you've seen a lot of things unfold here. We've talked about assessing while teaching, using that to come up with the edge. Then we talked about different interventions that go with procedural, conceptual, and then the application. You've just watched an excellent video clip on how to differentiate to accelerate. Notice that they were all moving forward. They were all moving forward, even though the rate was different and it may have looked different, they were all moving forward. So you have that piece to add. Before we add in the final component of our afternoon together, I want to give you a chance, Kateri and I want to give you a chance to process some of this out loud, because when we come back, we're going to talk about the implementation and evaluation part, which brings us back to full circle. evaluation has to be there. And so we're going to give you a moment to just talk amongst your colleagues. It's going to be the same groups you were with earlier. So I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. You'll have about 6 minutes to kind of think out loud very quickly. And then when you come back, we'll add the last part of this. So 6 minutes to process. When you come back, we'll add the next layer. See you in 6 minutes. That came through the request lines, and I decided to honor that request and make sure that if we were going to talk about Kenny Rogers, that we were going to play his music. Here's what we want to do. As we start to wind down, we've got a couple of key ideas that we want to add in here. And that is what we do and how we implement it matters a lot. Let me give you an example. If we go back to Katiri's differentiation discussion, if we don't implement the way we offer them choices about the process or the way we adjust the process, if we don't implement it well, it'll often fall apart. But implementation just isn't just about how we execute it. There are some components to implementation that I want us to think about before we wind down. For example, are we implementing this in a way that is aligned to our learning intentions and our success criteria? Because you noticed when you looked at all of those different strategies that they could be used for different things. For example, I could do spaced practice with procedural learning, but I could do spaced practice with conceptual understanding. Come back and get it again. Come back and get it again. I could use debates for conceptual understanding as well as which type of mathematics learning or what mathematics learning can be applied to this problem. Let's debate it out. There's an application debate. And so while we would love it to be clean cut, we would love it to be very clear, it is a lot like Kenny Rogers. The card you play is going to depend on what cards are being played on the table. And while it may be appropriate to play an ace in this hand, an ace may not be appropriate in a subsequent hand. And so not to beat that metaphor to death, although that's quite enjoyable for me, it does have to be implemented so that it aligns with that learning goal, which means we have to go back to our learning intentions and our success criteria and make sure that it lines up. Another problem I had as a teacher, this was me. And so this is a little bit of a confession, and then I promise I'll hand it over to Katiri to close us out. And that is, I used to try an intervention. Well, my coach told me I should try this intervention, and I did it on Tuesday, and they still didn't know it on Wednesday. I had a dosage problem. One and done doesn't work. And so am I providing the necessary dosage, or am I counting on the intervention being the elixir that's going to fix it all? And so are we giving it time? Are we giving it the right amount of time to have an impact? Then do we take what Katiri talked to us about in terms of content, process, and product, and are we making those adaptations based on their needs? Now, again, what are their strengths? What's the edge of their understanding? And what do I do next? And so am I making the adaptations, or am I taking a jigsaw and using it the same for everyone? That's going to mess with implementation. And finally, have I set my learning environment up for this? In other words, does the learning environment promote emotional safety? Does this learning environment promote inclusion, the belief that all students are valued members and are contributing to the environment, and that we're providing those supports? Do we promote the equity of access and opportunity to the highest level of learning possible? Or are we labeling our groups red, yellow, and green? And the red group seems to have something in common because they're not only together in math, They're also together in reading and social studies, and they never seem to be at physical education. Oh boy, that's not a quality environment. So are we making sure we have fidelity, dosage, adaptations, and are we making sure our environments are inclusive, equitable, and promote diversity as assets and address the unique profiles of each of our learners? Because then that leads us into our ability to really interpret that evidence. The last idea I want to share with you, and well, guess what? Then we're going to head on out and wrap up our time together. What works does require us to generate that evidence. And so we have to make sure that in the generation of that evidence, that we are indeed planning for it. We go into the intervention knowing this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for them to do these things. You saw Alicia do this in the video. She planned for her evaluation. She was constantly interpreting the evidence that she gathered. And here's the big one. Are we utilizing that evidence to make decisions about what to do next, or is it merely a mark in the grade book? And I don't mean that to be offensive, and I don't mean that to be disrespectful, but what is the evidence being used for? If it's used just so we can get our X number of marks per quarter in the book, then really it is a colossal waste of time. But if it's going to help me decide where to go next, and it's going to communicate to the learner where they need to go next, then you're guaranteed to accelerate. You're guaranteed to amplify that learning, and you're going to be better off in terms of mathematics teaching and learning. And so I want to send it back to Kateri to close us out. We've shared lots of ideas with you, and Kateri, you and I have talked during some of the breakout rooms that we're going to make this available for those that want more information and additional resources. In fact, you're going to close us out with a tie it all together idea. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, and I've been seeing the conversation in the chat, and it's so very real, right? What's happening now, it's not like in 2019 or 2018 where I had my kids and typically they were in school together every day for long periods of time, right? There is this quarantine bit where kids are leaving and coming back, and that is really hard to manage. And I think the piece of this that we keep coming back to is that we have to discover where students are, which is exactly what coming back to that evidence, right? So it's that cycle. We have to be teaching something, and then we have to say, okay, we're going to collect evidence to see who mastered it. And then when we have that information, we can make plans to move forward. Now, it might be plans to move forward further, longer, later than we thought it would be, right? But somehow we need to be collecting in this moment during our learning. While you're here, I'm going to find out what you did, what you said, what you wrote, how you were talking with someone else, so that I have that documented so I can remember, okay, now when we move into our next bit of learning, I'm going to think about what is that horizontal connection that exists between what we were learning when you were here last and what you understood, and where we are next, right? Where have we moved to? And those horizontal connections are so important for making this cycle be effective of discovering where students are, thinking about what type of learning are students engaged in, moving them forward with our intervention and the way that we differentiate to accelerate, and then collecting that data again. And if we keep thinking through, well, what's that horizontal connection, the thing mathematically that runs through it, we'll be able to keep moving all of our students forward. I also saw a really great question about, well, what does this mean now for us as math interventionists or math specialists or math coaches? Where are we if we're not pulling a kid to say, let's do this over here, but we're going to make sure that we're all working towards that goal and differentiating? Well, you saw it, hopefully, in that video with Alicia and Calder. Calder is the math specialist who was also doing math intervention. And she was another set of eyes and ears in that classroom to help collect that evidence, right? To help ask those questions, to help provide that just-in-time intervention, and then to meet with Alicia afterwards and say, okay, we've got 10 minutes. Let's look through the student work. Let's look through your observations. Here's what I heard. Here's what I saw. Here's what you heard. Here's what you saw. And let's make a plan for tomorrow about how to move forward. So being that extra eyes, extra ears to help move us forward is really powerful. You know, I've always wanted to have a classroom of 9 teachers. So, you know, maybe we can get there with 2. All right. So our work today was really focused on figuring out where is the edge of understanding for our learners, and then how do we meet them right in that spot and intervene, right? How do we structure our intervention? So how do we think through how we're going to discover it, what strategy we'll use, and then how we'll move forward and keep making that cycle happen to evaluate. So check in with yourselves. See what can you say from our work together and your work previously and your conversations. Can I describe this process for implementing what works best in math teaching and learning? Can I align interventions with the specific needs of math learners? Can I adapt my interventions to meet their diverse needs? And can I evaluate my impact on math learning? So hopefully you feel like you can move forward. Having like an absolute answer, I don't know that I've ever landed in that spot. Everything keeps changing, right? And so just feeling like, yes, I am moving forward in my mastery of that, and I am figuring out some strategies is definitely a really powerful place to be moving yourself forward instructionally with your strategies. So thank you. Thank you for all of your great ideas and questions. And thank you for being willing to take risks as teachers, right? To really practice this, deliberately practice our work of intervening just in time with just the right instruction at the edge of understanding.
Thank you, Kateri and John, so much for tonight's session. It was wonderful. We totally enjoyed it. And I know that the teachers have received lots of great information. I just wanted to let everyone know, if you enjoyed tonight's session,